welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into Japanese culture, but not the stuff you usually hear about. We're going deeper, looking at how ideas like hierarchy, honor, and shame shape how they act, especially during wartime.
Fascinating topic.
Yeah, our guide for this is going to be excerpts from Ruth Benedict's The Chrysanthemum and the Sword.
Ah, that's a classic. It's a really insightful look at Japanese values and obligations, and how they often clash with Western, especially American, perspectives.
When it comes to the way that the Japanese viewed the world
and
their moral compass, what's the first thing that really jumps out at you from this book?
One of the most striking things is that Japanese culture doesn't really operate on the same good versus evil axis as a lot of Western cultures.
Oh, interesting.
Instead, it's more about navigating different circles of obligation.
Circles of obligation. So it's not just like
what's the right thing?
Right and wrong. Yeah, it's much more nuanced than that.
Okay.
And so you can almost think of them like separate maps for different relationships in your life.
Okay. All right. So break it down for me. What are these circles?
Okay. So the first and arguably the most important circle is Chu.
Okay.
Which is loyalty to the emperor.
Ah, okay.
This was seen as the highest virtue.
So even above like personal morality.
Yeah, you can think about it like that. The emperor was seen as a divine figure,
right?
And serving him was like the ultimate duty.
Okay, so we got Chu, loyalty to the emperor.
We got Chu.
What's next?
Okay, so the next circle is Kud,
which is duty to your family.
Okay.
Your ancestors, your lineage.
So not just your immediate family, but like
their whole
family line.
Yeah, past, present, future.
That's a lot of pressure.
It is.
But how do you balance like loyalty to the emperor with your family?
Well, that's where it gets tricky, right? Because sometimes these circles can conflict. And then you bring in the third circle, which is Giri.
Giri. What is Giri?
So Giri is duty to others.
Okay.
And it can encompass a whole range of obligations.
Okay.
Everything from like showing gratitude to repaying debts and even seeking revenge.
Wait, revenge is like an obligation.
Yeah, so it might seem odd.
It's wild
to us.
Yeah.
But in Japanese culture, revenge wasn't really about personal satisfaction, right? It was about fulfilling a social obligation to restore honor if you or your family had been wronged.
So like maintaining social order and balance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Making things right.
So this must have caused some real dilemmas.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Benedict actually uses this really famous story from Japanese history to kind of illustrate this tension between Shu and Giri. And it's the story of the 47 Ronin.
Okay, I've heard of this.
Yeah.
But refresh my memory. What happened?
Okay, so it's a true story that took place in the 18th century, but it's become like legendary in Japan. So picture this. You are one of 47 samurai whose lord has been unjustly forced to commit suicide.
Oh, wow. That's intense.
Yeah.
Why was he forced to do that?
So their lord, Asano, was publicly insulted by another lord named Kira. And he felt he had to defend his honor.
Right.
So he drew his sword in the shogun's palace.
Oh, big mistake.
Yeah, you don't do that.
Not good.
It was a huge offense against Chu.
Right.
Right. Loyalty to the shogun, the ultimate authority.
It's like even though he was defending his own honor, he violated a higher duty.
Yeah, like you can't disrespect the shogun.
Yeah.
So to atone for this, Asano was ordered to commit ritual suicide.
Wow.
Seppuku.
Yeah.
And this leaves his 47 samurai, who are now Ronin because they no longer have a lord, in a really tough spot. Because they're bound by Giri to avenge their lord's death.
Right.
But doing so would mean rebelling against the shogun.
Which is the ultimate Chu.
Exactly.
Oh, man, that's a tough one.
Yeah, it's a real dilemma, right?
Yeah.
What do you do?
So what did they do?
So for over a year, the Ronin pretended to abandon their duty. They even acted dishonorably, like drinking, carousing.
Sneaky.
Just to like throw Kira off guard.
So they went undercover to plot their revenge.
Basically, yeah.
Duh.
They waited for the right time. And when the moment was right, they stormed Kira's mansion and they killed him.
So they chose their lord's honor over...
They fulfilled their Giri.
Over the shogun.
Yep. But here's where it gets even more interesting. After avenging their lord, all 47 Ronin... committed seppuku themselves.
Why?
They knew that they had broken the law, right? By taking justice into their own hands.
Right.
So they acknowledged this transgression against Shu
So they were trying to balance like both duties, even though it cost them their lives.
Exactly. And this story, it became like a powerful symbol in Japan.
Yeah.
Representing those complexities of their moral system.
Right.
But it also highlights this idea of makoto.
Makoto.
Which is sincerity.
Okay.
Now, in the West, we think of sincerity as being true to your feelings.
Right.
But in Japan, makoto is more about aligning your actions with the spirit of the code.
Huh.
So even if your personal feelings might conflict.
So the 47 Ronin weren't necessarily driven by like rage or hatred. It was about their duty.
Exactly, fulfilling their duty, yeah. Even though it was tragic.
Yeah, that is intense.
Yeah, and Benedict argues that this idea of makoto, it played a big role in how they approached many things.
Okay.
Including war.
Okay, so how does that play out?
So the Japanese, they believed that sincerity of effort, absolute dedication to the cause, was just as important as military strategy or weapons.
So it's not just about winning.
It's not just about winning, it's how you fight.
It's the spirit, yeah.
Exactly.
Wow.
And there's this anecdote from the Russo-Japanese War that I think illustrates this really well.
Okay, lay it on me.
So after a long siege, the Japanese general Nogi invites the defeated Russian general Stoessel to dinner.
Wait, they had dinner?
They had dinner together.
In the middle of a war?
Yeah, in the middle of a war.
That's why.
They shared stories, expressed sympathy for each other's losses. They even exchanged gifts.
So they could separate the act of war from
the individual people involved, yeah.
Wow.
And Benedict argues that for the Japanese, war was like this ritualized act. It wasn't about hatred. It was about fulfilling duty, upholding honor, demonstrating that makoto, sincerity in their actions.
Even to their enemies.
Even to their enemies.
Wow,
it's a different way of seeing things.
It really is. It really is.
Yeah.
So their moral compass is totally different than ours.
At least from a Western perspective,
yeah.
Very different. Benedict offers a unique lens for understanding their wartime choices. Moving beyond those simple good versus evil explanations.
Right, exactly. It's about understanding, not judging.
So one of the first things that jumps out from these excerpts is how important hierarchy is in Japanese culture. Benedict describes it as like this intricate system of proper place that influences everything from everyday interactions to Japan's role on the world stage. Yeah, and what's interesting is that modernization didn't get rid of this hierarchy. It was carefully woven into their new society. It shaped their government, how they organized industries, everything. Imagine how that affected their worldview. It's like they wanted to create a similar hierarchy in Asia with Japan at the top.
Wow, that's a really interesting point. And this hierarchy isn't just about like bowing lower or something. Benedict points out that the Japanese have different words for you, depending on who they're talking to.
Exactly. It's like having a different vocabulary for each level of the social ladder. It shows how deeply hierarchy is rooted in their society, emphasizing respect, deference, and knowing your place in this web of relationships. The sense of order is key to understanding how other values like duty and honor play out.
Speaking of duty, Benedict talks about gimu, the obligation to family and emperor, as one of the circles of obligation they navigate. And it's not just about fulfilling your role, it's about upholding the honor and reputation of those you're bound to.
And that sense of obligation to family is really powerful, especially through filial piety. What's striking is that it goes beyond loving your parents. Benedict describes a son taking the blame for his mother stealing, even though it leads to his wife killing herself. That's an intense example of how much weight society puts on those expectations and how much conflict it can cause within families.
That's a heavy burden. It makes you think about what it does to you psychologically to live with that level of responsibility. Benedict's description of the mother-in-law-daughter-in-law relationship as particularly strained really shows how these expectations play out.
Yeah, it's very different from Western ideals of individual freedom and pursuing happiness. The Japanese focus on fulfilling obligations, even if it means sacrificing their own desires. It's a fundamental difference in values.
And this isn't just about family, right? Benedict talks about, Gary, this complex web of social debts and obligations. It's like this invisible scorecard tracking everything, favors insults, even revenge. It's much more complex than just owing money.
Yeah, Giri is all about keeping social harmony and saving face. Every action has consequences for your social standing. Giri makes sure these scales of obligation stay balanced. Benedict even suggests this idea influenced how Japan reacted to things like the American Exclusion Act and the Naval Parity Treaty.
Yeah. How did Gary play into those events?
They saw those acts as huge insults to their national honor. They felt resentful, and it fed into their aggressive ambitions leading up to the war. It's like those events tipped the scales of Geary, and they needed a strong response to restore balance.
So it's not just about geopolitics. It's this deep cultural need to address perceived wrongs and show their strength on the world stage.
Exactly. Understanding this cultural lens helps us see past simple interpretations of what they did. It helps us appreciate how complex their motivations really were.
And this reminds me of another point Benedict emphasizes, the Japanese sensitivity to shame, Haji. She says it's not just embarrassment, it's about failing to live up to what's expected of you, losing face, potentially dishonoring your family or even the nation.
The weight of shame in Japanese culture is huge, and its influence shouldn't be underestimated. Benedict suggests that in some cases, suicide was seen as a way to regain honor, to take responsibility for what you did and erase the stain of failure.
Suicide is a solution. I can't imagine that being widely accepted in Western cultures. It seems so different from our views on self-preservation and personal responsibility.
You have to consider the cultural context. It wasn't about running away. It was seen as a brave way to clear your name, achieve spiritual purity, and even protect your family or group's honor.
That definitely challenges our ideas of what's considered honorable. It seems like growing up in Japan means navigating all these complex obligations, constantly balancing duty, honor, and this fear of shame. It's a world away from how many Western cultures raise kids with a focus on individuality and expressing yourself.
That difference in upbringing is something Benedict really highlights. She describes Japan as a nation of two faces, where childhood is all about indulgence and freedom, but adulthood brings this huge pressure to conform and meet societal expectations.
So it's like they get a taste of freedom, and then it's replaced by all these rigid rules and obligations. What a transition. How do they handle such a big shift in what's expected of them?
It's a fascinating process, actually. Benedict describes how Japanese babies are practically treated like royalty for their first few years. Constant physical contact carried everywhere, allowed to sleep whenever, wherever. It's very different from the more structured approach common in the West.
It's like they're given this unconditional love before society's expectations kick in. I'm curious, when does that shift happen? When do those expectations start to take hold?
Around 5 or 6 things start to change. Benedict observed the system of teasing and gentle ridicule they use to teach kids about conformity and avoiding shame. It's not like cruel bullying, it's more like subtle social pressure that encourages them to internalize the rules and value group harmony.
So they become really aware of how others see them, always adjusting their behavior so they don't stand out or cause problems. That must be a lot of pressure for a young kid. Does this focus on social harmony continue as they grow up?
Totally. As kids start school, Benedict notes how the Japanese education system, especially before the war, really focused on instilling obedience, loyalty, and a strong sense of national identity.
So it wasn't just academics. It was about molding them into the ideal citizen, ready to serve the emperor and the nation. It reminds me of how Benedict mentioned this idea of indebtedness being part of their education. They're taught to see themselves as owing society gratitude for their education and opportunities.
Right. That's a key point. This idea of debt goes beyond family. It includes teachers, superiors, even the nation itself. It's a powerful motivator, pushing them towards hard work, self-discipline, and putting collective goals ahead of their own desires.
But this raises a question. Where does individuality fit into all this?
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be much room for self-expression or chasing your own dreams when you're constantly focused on your obligations to others.
Yeah.
How do they reconcile this?
That's a tension that Benedict explores. While Japanese culture values fitting in and doing your duty, there's still space for personal expression, especially in the arts. She noticed how much the Japanese appreciate beauty craftsmanship, mastering a skill. Even if those skills are expressed through traditional forms like calligraphy, tea ceremony, or gardening.
So they're not rejecting individuality completely. They're channeling it through these established ways of expressing themselves. It's like finding ways to be themselves within their cultural values, not breaking free from them.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Muga, that selflessness we talked about. It's not about erasing your identity. It's more about transcending your ego and becoming one with whatever you're doing, whether it's serving your family, mastering a craft, or creating art.
So it's about finding fulfillment through dedication and striving for perfection. Not chasing fame or recognition. It's a different way of thinking about ambition and success.
It is, and it's this dedication and attention to detail that contributed to Japan's reputation for craftsmanship and innovation. Benedict argues that this cultural focus on duty and exceeding expectations played a big role in their quick modernization and rise as a global power.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
But all this emphasis on duty and self-discipline must have a downside, right? Benedict mentions the potential psychological toll of living under so much pressure, the possibility of anxiety, depression, even suicide. It's hard to ignore that.
You're right, Japan does have a high suicide rate, and Benedict examines the cultural factors that might be contributing to this. She suggests that the pressure to conform, the fear of shaming yourself or your family, and the limited ways to express certain emotions can lead to a sense of hopelessness for some people.
It's like they're always walking on a tightrope with no room for mistakes.
Yeah.
How do they deal with these intense emotions and the constant fear of failure?
Benedict saw that the Japanese have developed coping mechanisms, things like rituals, strong social support systems, and even acceptable indulgences like drinking and socializing. These offer a temporary escape from the pressures of daily life.
Like a pressure valve release, letting them blow off steam and connect with their human need for connection and emotional expression. It's about finding that balance between duty and pleasure.
Exactly, and goes back to Benedict's idea of human feelings. It's that space where spontaneity, emotional release, and even a little rebellion against social norms are allowed.
So it's like they have this dual nature, the disciplined, self-sacrificing side focused on duty, and then this other side that craves pleasure and release. It's a fascinating paradox.
It is, and Benedict says this duality is key to understanding Japanese culture. It's a society that embraces order and chaos restraint and indulgence, tradition, and modernity. This ability to hold these seemingly opposite ideas is what helps them adapt and thrive in a changing world.
That's a really good point. It makes me realize that trying to understand Japan from a Western perspective makes you miss so much. It's a culture with its own unique values and beliefs. It's time to shift gears a bit. We've talked about these cultural values in general, but how do they show up during war? Benedict doesn't hold back from looking at the darker side of these values and how they shaped Japan's military actions.
That's a crucial area to examine. The military is where those values were often intensified, sometimes with terrible consequences.
This feels kind of heavy. When we talk about the military, we're talking about actions that have real consequences. And Benedict doesn't shy away from that. She talks about how giri, that need to repay debts, even those of vengeance, played a role in their wartime aggression. It's like they felt this obligation to right perceived wrongs, to restore their honor on the world stage.
You have to remember that Japan's military leaders saw the world through that hierarchy lens we talked about. They believed it was their destiny to lead Asia, to build a new order based on their values. Any threat to that ambition, any insult they met with fierce determination.
Almost like they had something to prove, especially to the West. Benedict mentions the American Exclusion Act and the Naval Parity Treaty as events that really stung, fueled that resentment and desire to prove their strength.
They saw those events as humiliation, as being denied their rightful place. And that feeling was amplified by the military's propaganda, portraying the war as this righteous fight to free Asia from the West.
So it wasn't just about conquering land. It was about restoring honor, proving their power, and creating a new world order based on their values. That's a very different view from how many in the West saw the war. But knowing what we do about their values kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it makes you question those simple ideas of good versus evil.
Yeah.
Benedict's work reminds us to look deeper than those labels and try to understand the complex reasons behind what people do.
And that complexity becomes really clear when we talk about seppuku and its role in the military. It wasn't just a thing of the past, it was still happening during the war.
Seppuku was a way for soldiers to avoid being captured, to choose an honorable death over the shame of surrender. And that expectation went all the way up the chain of command. Several high-ranking officers chose seppuku after Japan lost.
That's so different from Western military traditions where surrender could be a strategic move, and prisoners of war have certain rights. This leads to a really tough topic. Japan's treatment of POWs, Benedict details the brutality and neglect that Allied prisoners went through. It's honestly hard to read those accounts without feeling angry and horrified.
Those accounts are really disturbing. They remind us of the human costs of war and how dangerous it is when cultures misunderstand each other. Benedict says that in Japanese culture, surrendering was often seen as weakness, dishonorable, maybe even less than human. It's like they couldn't grasp why someone would choose to live as a prisoner instead of dying in battle.
And where does giri, that sense of obligation, fit into this? Because from our point of view, basic human compassion should matter more than cultural differences, especially in a situation as bad as being a prisoner of war.
Benedict suggests that Japanese soldiers felt they had no giri, no obligation to those who hadn't lived up to their own warrior code. To them, the prisoners had dishonored themselves by surrendering, so they were outside the circle of those who deserved compassion. It's a chilling example of how cultural differences twisted by war can lead to terrible cruelty.
It makes you think how they reconcile those actions with their own values of honor and duty, values that in other situations seem to emphasize compassion and responsibility. Were they just blinded by propaganda, Or was there something more going on?
It's a question people still debate. The influence of propaganda was definitely there. But Benedict thinks there's more to it. She suggests that the Japanese had a different idea of empathy and compassion, one shaped by their view of hierarchy. Compassion was usually reserved for those within their own circle of obligation, family, community, nation.
So it's not that they lacked compassion altogether, it's that it was directed in a very specific way, guided by their culture and their understanding of where they fit in the social order.
It's complicated and there are no easy answers, but Benedict's work makes us face the fact that even cultures that value honor and duty can do terrible things, especially during war.
It's a reminder that understanding different cultures is so important for peace. But those differences can also be dangerous, especially when mixed with conflict and ideology. So where do we go from here? What have we learned from this deep dive into Japanese culture?
We've come away with a deeper understanding of a culture that's often misunderstood. We've seen how values like hierarchy, duty, honor, and shame are deeply ingrained and influence everything from everyday life to global events. And while those values can lead to positive things like dedication, loyalty, and striving for excellence, they can also have devastating consequences, as we saw during the war.
It reminds us that studying another culture isn't about judging them as better or worse than our own. It's about understanding what makes people tick, what motivates them, and the complexity of human nature. And maybe in that understanding, we can find a way to be more empathetic and create a more peaceful world.
Exactly. Like Benedict said, real understanding means stepping outside of our own cultural boxes and appreciating all the different ways people experience the world. Until next time, keep diving deeper.